So today I'm going to talk about the dimension of chaos that is the unpredictability of chaotic systems, specifically how that unpredictability challenges our decision-making from a national policy level. So technology is fantastic, love it, pretty amazing. Comes with sometimes unconsidered dangers that we suffer the consequences of. And what we try to do is we try to protect ourselves, each other, from harmful effects of technology with regulatory policy. But we don't want to overly restrict beneficial technologies, and so what we try to do is we try to figure out what is the appropriate amount of regulation given the risks a technology may pose and weighed against the benefits. And so sort of the paragon of how we make these decisions, how much precaution is worth having and worth investing in, is based on a couple things. When we do risk-benefit analysis, we want to know exactly how likely are the various outcomes, so how likely are the various harmful and beneficial outcomes, and how good or bad are they? And what we want to do is we want to calculate expected values here, because we want policy that is, on average, in our best interest. So it's just like gambling, right? We calculate the expected values, just like a poker player would calculate pot odds. And if we make this kind of decision-making continuously, we're making good bets as we move forward, just, bets with our health and safety and ecosystems and all that. Okay, so you might ask, well, how do we get expected values for things that we're trying to protect with our regulatory policy? I mean, we're talking about human lives here, ecosystems. How do we weigh those potential costs that could be harmed along with weighing those against the benefits of the technologies that we enjoy? And what we end up doing is we end up putting dollar values on everything at the end of the day. Okay, so how do we put a dollar value on a human life? Well, turns out we're not willing to protect our lives at all costs. That is, in everyday decision-making, we are willing to risk our lives to some extent in reasonable amounts to get some benefit. So the value that the EPA currently puts on the statistical value of a human life is $7.1 million. You might say, I'm worth $7.1 million? That's it? Come on. But what we do is we look at differences in wages between risky work and non-risky work of similar skill. And we find that if there is an amount of money there's an amount of money you're able to pay someone, that they'll be then willing to accept some small percentage increased risk of death on the job that's rational for them to take. So when we know how likely different consequences are, and we know how good or bad they are, we can calculate expected values. But the big problem with this approach to decision-making is that sometimes we're just very uncertain about how likely various outcomes are. And some examples here of uncertainty as a function of these kinds of issues that we're dealing with currently, and we can see with global warming, genetically modified organisms, great amount of uncertainty as to how probable various outcomes are. And this kind of cost-benefit or risk-benefit analysis decision-making begins to break down. So what do we do then when we want to rationally approach the question of how much precaution are we willing to pay for to keep us safe from dangers when we don't know the probabilities, where we can't calculate these expected values? Well, in Europe, not so much in the US, but in Europe, an approach called the precautionary principle is widely adopted. And what's interesting about this approach is that what the precautionary principle advises is that we take additional precautions, that we're extra careful when there are plausible, significant dangers and we don't know their probabilities. So where we don't know how likely an event is and it's significantly bad, we play it safe. Better safe than sorry. Okay? Nice example of this kind of principle for decision-making being actually implemented is a case of Pfizer Animal Health. And this is a case of the use of an antibiotic called virginiamycin that was being used and added to animal feed. So, for example, you might give dairy cows extra antibiotics in their animal feed to promote their productivity and to prevent infection. Very cost-effective, Agribusiness loves this. But European Union said, I don't know if we should just be sprinkling antibiotics into the feed. Why? Why would we want to avoid that? Well, it turns out that bacteria strains can develop resistance to antibiotics. And so Pfizer challenged this ban, and the court ruled against the challenge, saying that we don't need to know how likely it is that antibiotic-resistant strains will emerge. We just need to recognize that it is plausible, that that could pose a significant threat, and so let's not do that. Okay. Now, you might think this is a kind of important step to be able to take in policy decision-making, that we don't need to know precisely how likely a danger is in order to take precautionary steps to safeguard against it, right? If we had to wait until we were absolutely certain about how bad and how probable a danger is until we do something about it, oftentimes it'll be too late. We need to take steps preventatively, and that's just what the precautionary principle asks us to do. The problem, though, with existing precautionary principles is that they only advise us to take these additional precautions when we're faced with a danger that we recognize as existing. We just don't know how likely it is. But that's not always the problem when it comes to keeping ourselves safe from the dangers of emerging technologies. So CFCs were manufactured for decades before we understood their impact on the ozone layer and how harmful damage to that ozone layer could be. And DDT was sprayed all over the place before we knew its harmful effects and disruptive capabilities on our endocrine systems. So the problem here is not that we knew that there was a danger to the ozone, or that we knew that synthetic chemicals could dock with hormone receptors and wreak havoc. It's that we didn't even recognize these dangers as possibilities. They were unconsidered dangers. And what we'd like to somehow codify a way to safeguard ourselves moving forward from these kinds of dangers, unconsidered dangers. So what I want to try to make sense of is, how can it be moving forward that we're able to recognize when a new technology poses unconsidered dangers, dangers that we're not yet aware of? Can we become more aware of our own ignorance and take steps to keep us safe from unconsidered dangers? Now, what I'm saying is crazy. Why is it crazy? Because I'm saying, look, here's what we should do. We should avoid things we haven't even considered. And you might say, well, how is it that I could avoid that which I haven't even considered at all? That's impossible, right? You can never anticipate the unconsidered, since by hypothesis, you're not considering it, right? How can you avoid something you're unaware of? But I think that there is a possible way to build a scientific research program that will get us to a spot where we can recognize situations where it's more likely that there's significant effects that we're failing to recognize or take into account. And so what I think we need to research more in cognitive science and in social psychology is mechanisms that can result in dangers escaping our attention. So what causes some dangers to be unconsidered? Now, we've all actually had the kind of experience in just day-to-day life where you smack your head and you go, oh, I should have thought of that. Why didn't I think of that? That is, there was something that was a cost to you that you could have acted to prevent had you thought of it. That is, it was a plausible effect in your life that had you considered it, you could have done something to prevent it, but you just didn't think of this. So how can we actually work to eliminate this at the sort of policy level when it comes to environmental health and human safety? And I think that there are some plausible causal mechanisms that we can point to for what it is that makes us not consider enough possibilities when it comes to the dangers of emerging technologies. And I think there's causes both at the social level and at the individual psychological level as well. So here's what I mean by a cause of our not considering a potential danger at the social level. So how is it that we identify harmful possibilities when it comes to emerging technologies? Well, it's through scientific inquiry. But scientific inquiry is something that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in society. It happens in institutions and with experts working with one another. And there's different ways that this can go, better or worse. So, for example, consider medical research or heart disease research in the 1950s or 60s. Who's doing the research by and large? Well, it's mostly white males, and a lot of the research subjects are white males too. So we could worry that when a question is just being asked through a very homogeneous group of individuals, right, from similar backgrounds, working in similar disciplines, they're going to ask similar questions. Whereas if you have a more diverse group of researchers working on a problem, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, and from different disciplines, importantly, working on the same problem, more relevant questions are going to be asked. So I think one way to take steps to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from unconsidered dangers is making sure that we have many different kinds of questions being asked by different kinds of experts and non-experts alike. Now, at the individual psychological level, I think one way of attacking this problem is by looking at what's called the Heuristics and Biases Research Program in cognitive psychology. And there's a lot of really interesting research about how it is that our attention gets fixated on various aspects of a problem. And heuristics are basically really quick rules of thumb that we use in our everyday thinking that basically leave out the hard work of exactly calculating what's going to happen, and instead we replace that with sort of quick, intuitive reasoning. And I want to talk about one of these heuristics because I think it's pretty relevant to the question of what gets unconsidered. So the availability heuristic is this. When an event is very easily imaginable or very easy to recall from memory, we judge it to be more probable. Okay? Now, how easy it happens to be for you to picture or recall something doesn't actually affect how probable that thing is, but that's how we think. Let me give you an example of this kind of effect. So researchers asked a group of undergraduate students the following question. They told them, there's a disease that has an increasing prevalence on campus. It's called hypocenia B, completely made-up disease, and they tell them that afterwards. And they say, look, hypocenia B, it's pretty nasty stuff. If you get it, you'll get severe headaches, severe muscle cramps, symptoms that are really easy to picture. You've all had headaches, you've all had a muscle cramp, you know what that's like. Same researchers told another group of students, there's this disease, increasing prevalence on campus, hypocenia B, and they told them symptoms that are really hard to picture, symptoms you probably haven't had before, like a malfunctioning nervous system and an inflamed liver. And then what they asked the students is, how likely do you think it is that you'll actually contract hypocenia B? And the students who are told the symptoms that are much easier to picture judge it to be much more probable that they'll get hypocenia B. So harder to picture symptoms probably won't happen to me. Easily imaginable symptoms? Oh yeah, that could happen. Okay? So that's the kind of effect that we see in our thinking. The affect heuristic is another interesting way in which we think. Turns out if you like a technology, you think it has low risks. So, interesting study that sort of characterizes this aspect of our thinking. Researchers asked folks to rank the benefits and risks of an array of different technologies, things like preservatives in food, fluoridated water, a bunch of things that offer both risks and benefits. And then what they do is they show participants in this study a really persuasive message about the high benefits of each of these technologies. That is, how much benefit we actually enjoy from them. And then they ask participants, would you like to recharacterize your understanding of the costs and benefits of each of these technologies? And what happens is, after you show people the persuasive message about how beneficial each of these technologies are, when they recharacterize their understanding of the benefits and risks, they lower the risks. That is, if you understand that something offers lots of benefits, you're predisposed to jump to the conclusion at an unconscious level that the costs or the risks must be low. Of course, there's no reason why that should be. There's all kinds of high benefit, high risk technologies, like nuclear power, for example. High benefits, but also high risks. And so here's, just to sort of wrap up, here's my thinking on how we could somehow avoid unconsidered dangers going forward. Scientific attention is limited. We can't consider every conceivable problem a technology could bring on us. And what we end up selecting as plausible risks that we should investigate more scientifically is a function of our heuristics and biases. Okay? So we really need to ask, are the hypothetical dangers of some technology that we're worried about, are these dangers that our natural psychological tendencies are really predisposed to latch onto and say, well, that's very probable, that's really likely? If so, our psychology has been doing a lot of the hypothesis selection for us rather than consciously attending more to just theory and data into what we should more thoroughly consider.